In 1949, Carl Jung conducted an experiment, one he never published. It involved just 5 patients, all empaths. His request was deceptively simple: spend an entire day prioritizing only their own wants and needs, without considering anyone else. A day of pure self-interest. All 5 failed, but not because they didn't want to, because neurologically they couldn't. When they tried to be selfish, their brains went into panic mode, literally. And Jung, at the age of 74, realized something that would change everything he had written about personality. He noted in his private papers, only discovered in 2019, that the empath isn't born with a bigger heart. The empath is simply the child who was never allowed to be selfish. And when you understand that, everything changes. Decades later, in 2022, Andrew Huberman, unaware of Jung's experiment, replicated the same thing using neuroimaging. And what he saw in the brains of these empaths was terrifying. Before we continue, you need to understand something. If you're the kind of person who feels guilty when you prioritize your needs, if you feel selfish for saying no, if you grew up believing your worth lies in being useful to others, this video will reorganize everything you think you know about yourself. Because Jung wasn't talking about empathy, he was talking about trauma. And Huberman proved it, brain by brain, scan by scan. Jung's final message wasn't about love, it was a warning he couldn't publish because it was too late, but that Huberman unknowingly validated 73 years later. We've been taught that empathy is a gift, that being altruistic is spiritual evolution, that feeling for others is a sign of maturity. And that's wrong, completely wrong, because the true empath, what Jung called the structurally empathetic individual, didn't choose to be this way. They were conditioned in childhood by emotionally dysregulated parents who needed an external regulator. And that child, who should have been developing healthy self-interest between the ages of 2 and 7, had to learn to read micro-expressions to survive. Huberman discovered in 2022 what Jung intuited in 1949. When you scan the brain of a true empath as they try to do something just for themselves, 3 regions enter extreme conflict, and one of those regions should be inactive. But in the empath, it's chronically hyperactivated since childhood. I'm going to show you exactly what happens in the brain when a child is forced to never be selfish, and why, decades later, you still feel like you don't deserve to take up space. Jung was 74 years old when he conducted that secret experiment. It was 1949, 3 years before his last great work. He was obsessed with a question that academia refused to discuss. Why did some patients improve with individuation and others get worse? He noticed a pattern. The patients who got worse were always the most empathetic, the ones who cared the most, the ones who helped the most. And the more Jung tried to help them individuate, the more guilt they felt, as if individualizing was a betrayal. So he did the experiment. 5 patients, all diagnosed with what he called chronic structural empathy, people who literally couldn't separate their emotions from the emotions of others. The instruction was simple. 1 entire day focused exclusively on themselves. Eat whatever they wanted, whenever they felt hungry. Do only what they felt like doing. Completely ignore the emotional needs of other people around them. 24 hours of total self-interest. The first patient, a 38-year-old woman named Elizabeth, quit in 4 hours. She started to feel heart palpitations, cold sweats, panic, as if something terrible was about to happen. When Jung asked what she feared, she said, "If I don't take care of things, someone will get hurt, and it will be my fault." But there was no one around. She was alone in her own home, following the instructions. And still, her body went into survival mode. Jung noted, self-interest for her isn't a behavior to be avoided. It's neurologically impossible. As if her brain had been reprogrammed to recognize self-care as a life-threatening danger. 3 of the 5 patients developed intense physical symptoms: nausea, tremors, depersonalization. One of them said something that Jung circled 3 times in red in his journal. I felt like I was disappearing, like without anyone needing me, I would cease to exist. And that's when Jung understood. The empath doesn't have a bigger heart. The empath has been conditioned to believe that their existence is only justified when it's in service to someone else. And that isn't love. That's self-erasure, he wrote on the last page of that journal. The empath doesn't love more. The empath dissolves and calls it virtue. Hold on, because what Jung discovered about the childhoods of these patients is where Huberman comes in 73 years later. Jung exhaustively interviewed the 5 empaths from the experiment. He wanted to understand one thing: when exactly was healthy self-interest blocked? And all 5 had the same story. Between the ages of 2 and 7, the phase in which children naturally develop what Jung called necessary egocentrism, something interrupted the process. Elizabeth, the patient who panicked, remembered clearly. She was 4 years old. Her mother suffered from severe depression, and Elizabeth learned, without anyone explicitly teaching her, that if she cried too much, her mother got worse. So she stopped crying. But it wasn't just that. She started to monitor her mother's face, her tone of voice, the silences. At 4 years old, Elizabeth already knew how to predict her mother's emotional breakdowns before her mother even knew. And when she sensed them coming, she changed her behavior. She became quiet, helpful, invisible. Jung called this inverted emotional parentification. The child becomes the parent's therapist, and the brain at that age is in full formation. Maximum neuroplasticity, which means that this pattern isn't learned, it's neurologically incorporated. Another patient, a 42-year-old man, reported something similar: an alcoholic father, unpredictable, violent, and he, at the age of 5, learned to read his father, the way he walked, the smell, the tone of voice. If his father arrived in one mood, the boy stayed quiet. If he arrived in another, he tried to be funny, to lighten the mood. At 5 years old, he was already an external emotional regulator, not because he wanted to, because he needed to survive. And Jung realized the pattern. In all 5 cases, between the ages of 2 and 7, the child was forced to inhibit healthy self-interest and develop emotional hypervigilance, not by choice, by necessity for survival. He wrote, "These children didn't develop empathy. They developed a warning system to regulate dysregulated adults, and the brain at this phase crystallizes this system as a permanent structure. When these children grow up, they don't know this happened. They believe they are naturally empathetic, naturally altruistic, but Jung discovered the truth. They're afraid, unconscious, deep-seated fear that if they don't take care of others, something bad will happen. And even as adults, far from their parents, that fear remains because it's wired into their brains." And here's where things get chilling. Because Huberman, in 2022, without knowing about Jung's private papers, measured exactly what Jung was describing and saw it happening live in the brain. Hold on to what Jung discovered about parentification, because Huberman literally photographed it in the brains of 63 adult empaths, and what he found was disturbing. Huberman, in a study that wasn't widely publicized back in 2022, recruited 63 adults who self-identified as highly empathetic. But he didn't just want run-of-the-mill empaths. He wanted what he termed high-reactivity empaths. People who reported extreme difficulty prioritizing themselves, chronic guilt when setting boundaries, and a feeling that their worth lay in being useful. Exactly the profile of Jung's patients. Huberman's protocol was simple. Put these people in a functional MRI scanner and ask them to do two things. First, imagine helping someone in distress. Second, imagine doing something just for themselves, ignoring someone who was asking for help. In the first scenario, helping someone, the empath's brains showed normal activation. Ventral, medial, prefrontal cortex activated, involved in social cognition, anterior insula activated, processing empathy, limbic system calm, everything as expected, everything healthy. But in the second scenario, prioritizing themselves, something bizarre happened. Three regions entered severe conflict. First, the anterior cingulate cortex, the region of guilt and self-criticism, fired up. Extreme hyperactivation, as if the person was committing a grave moral wrong. Second, the amygdala, the center of fear, activated intensely. Not normal discomfort activation, survival threat activation, as if prioritizing oneself was dangerous. Third, and here's the most disturbing part, the insula, which in the first scenario was processing empathy, now showed a pattern of dissociative activation, as if the brain was trying to disconnect from its own internal experience. Huberman described it this way: it's as if the empath's brain had been trained to recognize self-care as a security breach. But there's more. Huberman compared these results with a control group of empathetic people, but without parentification in childhood. People who also cared about others, but could prioritize themselves without guilt. In those brains, prioritizing themselves didn't activate the amygdala, didn't trigger the anterior cingulate. The insula continued processing cognitive empathy, but without dissociation. The difference: Huberman investigated their childhoods and discovered that 89% of the high reactivity empaths reported parentification between the ages of 2 and 7. Emotionally unstable parents, a need to regulate adults, inhibition of childhood self-interest. Exactly what Jung had discovered back in 1949, without technology, without neuroimaging, just deep clinical observation. Huberman was, unknowingly, validating Jung's secret experiment 73 years later. And there's even more. Huberman did something else. He asked the empaths, still in the scanner, to try to suppress the guilt, to try consciously to rationalize that it was okay to prioritize themselves. And what happened was fascinating. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region of reason and cognitive control, tried to inhibit the anterior cingulate, tried to shut down the guilt, but it couldn't. The guilt came back, stronger, as if the more the person tried to suppress it, the more the brain reacted. Huberman called this a cognition-resistant guilt loop. The empath's guilt isn't irrational, it's subcortical. It's below reason, in the limbic system, engraved during childhood neuroplasticity. You can't think your way out of it because it wasn't thought in. And that's where Huberman found what Jung called the block to individuation. Jung said that structural empaths can't individuate because individuation requires healthy self-interest, requires the ability to say, I exist, independently of being useful. But if the brain has been trained to believe that existing independently is dangerous, individuation becomes neurologically terrifying. Let me show you why this is being hidden, because when you understand the origin, the entire self-help industry crumbles. The reason why Jung's final message about empaths wasn't widely publicized isn't accidental, it's structural. If you understand that the empath wasn't born empathetic, but was conditioned by childhood trauma, three entire industries lose their foundation. First, the New Age spirituality industry. How many coaches, gurus, and speakers sell the idea that empaths are evolved souls, old souls, beings of light who came to heal the world? That narrative is seductive. It makes the empath feel special, chosen, but it's dangerous because it romanticizes trauma, transforms childhood parentification into a spiritual mission. And while the empath believes they were born to serve, they never question why they can't exist outside of that function. Jung was fighting against this back in 1949. He saw patients spiritualizing their dysfunction, calling what was, in reality, an open wound a gift. And he knew that as long as the wound was called a gift, it would never be healed. Huberman in 2022 saw the same thing. Empaths arriving at the lab saying, "I'm an empath, it's my nature," and Huberman would show them the scan. No, this is dissociation. This is an overactive amygdala. This is unresolved parentification. Second industry, the toxic productivity culture. Empaths are the ideal workers. They don't complain. They don't set boundaries. They work until they collapse because they believe their worth lies in being useful. If you teach the empath that they were conditioned, that they can reprogram, that they don't have to dissolve to have worth, you lose the perfect worker. You lose the person who accepts exploitation because they feel guilt when they say no. Companies don't want healed empaths. Companies want functional empaths, and the difference is this: the functional empath serves until they die. The healed empath serves with boundaries. Third industry, dysfunctional relationships. Narcissists, manipulators, emotionally unavailable people gravitate towards empaths because the empath was trained from the age of 2 to regulate the dysregulated. If you teach the empath that this is trauma, that they can leave, that they aren't responsible for fixing anyone, you destabilize millions of codependent relationships. Relationships that appear functional because one person completely sacrifices themselves for the other. Jung knew this. He saw patients who improved psychologically, but whose marriages fell apart because the marriage only worked while the empath was dissolved. When the empath started to exist, the partner went into crisis, and the social pressure was immense. You've changed. You're being selfish. You're not the person I fell in love with anymore. Andrew Huberman saw this in long-term follow-ups. Empaths who went through the reprogramming protocol reported drastic improvement in anxiety, depression, and vitality. But they also reported relational breakups. Friends drifted away. Partners complained. Family members said, "You're not as understanding as you used to be." Because these people didn't love the empath. They loved the function. And here's what's truly terrifying. When Carl Jung published parts of his findings about parentification in 1952, in the revised book, Symbols of Transformation, the academic reaction was brutal. They said he was blaming the parents, that he was pathologizing empathy, that he was being reductionist. But Jung wasn't blaming, he was naming, and naming is the first step to deprogramming. Huberman faced similar resistance in 2022. Reviewers of the study asked him to soften the language, to not use the word trauma, to not connect empathy with parentification because it would offend too many people. But Huberman refused. He said, "If we don't name it, there's no cure." And he published it anyway. The message is clear. The empath has been conditioned, and as long as they believe it's a gift, they remain trapped. But when they understand it's a wound, they can begin to heal. And the cure isn't suppressing empathy. It's developing what Jung called sacred selfishness, the ability to exist fully without needing a function. Now, let me show you the exact protocol that unites Jung and Huberman. How to reverse 30, 40, 50 years of conditioning, and why it works, even when nothing else has. The Jung-Huberman protocol for empathic deprogramming has 4 phases, and each phase corresponds to a specific neural reorganization. It's not talk therapy. It's not positive affirmation. It's subcortical reprogramming. Phase 1. Naming the parentification. Duration 30 days. Jung discovered that the empath doesn't know they've been parentified. They believe they've always been this way, naturally caring. So, the first step is naming the pattern. Huberman tested this with a simple protocol. Every time the empath felt guilt when prioritizing themselves, they had to write down 3 things. First, what I wanted to do. Second, why I felt guilty. Third, whose emotion was I trying to regulate? This third point is critical because the empath doesn't realize. When they feel guilt, it's usually because someone around them is uncomfortable. And the empath's brain, trained since childhood, interprets the other's discomfort as personal danger. By writing down whose emotion it was, the empath starts to differentiate. Is this mine? Or is this theirs? And this differentiation activates the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region that Jung called the internal witness. After 30 days of daily naming, Huberman measured changes. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region of guilt, began to show a reduction in hyperactivation, not elimination, reduction. The brain was starting to recognize, this isn't mine. Phase 2. Daily micro-selfishnesses. Duration, 60 days. Jung called this progressive individuation training. The idea is simple. If the empath can't be selfish for an entire day, like in the 1949 experiment, you start with microdoses. Huberman structured it like this. Every day, the empath had to do one small thing just for themselves that would normally generate guilt. Examples: eating something they wanted without asking if anyone else wanted it, leaving a boring conversation without an elaborate explanation, saying no without justifying. The rule was, it had to be something small enough to be bearable, but large enough to activate discomfort. And here's the crucial part. After doing the micro-selfishness, the empath had to sit for 5 minutes and just feel the discomfort, without suppressing it, without rationalizing it, just feel it. Why? Because the brain needs to learn that the discomfort isn't dangerous. The amygdala fires because it's been trained to associate self-care with threat. But if you sit with the discomfort and nothing bad happens, the amygdala starts to recalibrate. Huberman called this conditioned fear extinction. It's the same technique used to treat phobias. Gradual exposure. The brain learns, I can do this, and survive. After 60 days, Huberman saw significant changes. The amygdala reduced its activation during self-care scenarios by 34%. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, involved in emotional decision-making, started to process self-care as neutral, not as a threat. The empaths reported, I still feel guilt, but I can act, even feeling it. And that's exactly the goal, not to eliminate the emotion, to disconnect the emotion from paralysis. Phase 3. Identity confrontation. Duration, 90 days. Here's where Jung separated the empaths who would heal from those who would remain trapped. Because this phase requires something terrifying. Answering the question, who am I? When I'm not useful. Jung did this through what he called active imagination. He asked the empath to visualize themselves in a scenario where no one needed them, no one, and then observe what emerged. Invariably, what emerged was emptiness, panic, a sense of not existing, because the empath's identity is completely fused with the function. Huberman replicated this with a daily writing protocol, every day, for 90 days. The empath had to answer, "What do I want?" Independent of what anyone else needs from me. In the beginning, the empaths froze. They didn't know. They literally didn't know what they wanted, because they had never asked. But Huberman insisted, even if the answer was, "I don't know." Right, "I don't know," because the act of confronting the question daily forces the prefrontal cortex to search for an answer. And eventually, something starts to emerge. Small things at first. I want silence. I want not to be asked how I am. I want not to have to explain. And then bigger things. I want to do something that no one will understand. I want to be misinterpreted and not justify myself. I want to exist without proving that I deserve it. Huberman measured this neurologically. After 90 days, something fascinating happened. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the region of self-concept, began to show independent activation. Before, this region only activated when the empath thought about themselves in relation to others. Now, it activated when they thought about themselves, period. Jung called this the birth of the true self. Huberman called it neural differentiation of the self-concept. Same thing, different languages. Phase 4, sacred selfishness. Duration, continuous. The final phase has no end. It's a lifelong practice. Jung described it this way. Sacred selfishness isn't doing whatever you want without considering others. It's doing what you want, knowing that others will be uncomfortable, and choosing to do it anyway. Huberman tested this with a challenge. Each empath had to, once a week, do something meaningful for themselves that would disappoint someone, not intentionally cruel, but something that would generate discomfort in the other person. Examples: canceling a social engagement without an elaborate excuse, declining a request for help without justifying yourself, doing something alone that you'd normally do accompanied to please someone else. And here's the point. After doing it, the empath had to observe the other person's reaction and not try to fix it. This is brutal for the empath, because the instinct, etched in over decades, is, if the other person is uncomfortable, I fix it. But Huberman discovered, if you always fix it, the brain never learns that you can tolerate the other person's disapproval. So, the rule is, leave the other person uncomfortable. Don't explain. Don't justify. Don't fix it. Just observe. What happens neurologically is powerful. The insula, which previously dissociated during self-care, now maintains connection. The empath manages to feel their own internal experience, while the other person is uncomfortable. They don't dissolve. Jung used to say, when you can exist fully, while the other person disapproves, you are individuated. Huberman validated this. Empaths who completed the 4 phases showed, on average, a 67% reduction in generalized anxiety, a 58% reduction in depressive symptoms, and most importantly, 81% reported, for the first time in adult life, the sensation that they existed independently of a function. But there's something that Jung warned about, and that Huberman confirmed. When the empath heals, the people around them go into crisis because they've lost their emotional regulator. And here, you discover who really loved you, because the person who loved you will celebrate your healing, even if it's uncomfortable for them. But the person who loved the function will punish you, blame you, accuse you of having changed. And Jung said, if someone accuses you of selfishness, when you finally start to exist, that person never saw you. They only saw what you did for them. Remember Jung's experiment in 1949? The 5 empaths who couldn't be selfish for a single day? Jung followed them, 4 of them, after years of work, managed to complete the challenge, and all 4 reported the same thing. It wasn't liberation, it was grief. Grief for who they could have been if they'd had permission to be selfish at age 4. Grief for the decades spent regulating adults who should have regulated themselves. Grief for the lost childhood. But after the grief, something new. Huberman saw this in 2022. The empaths who completed the protocol went through a phase that he called identity reconstruction. They started to discover tastes, desires, opinions that they never knew they had. Because for the first time, they had internal space to listen to themselves. One participant in Huberman's study, a 48-year-old woman named Jennifer, said something that he quoted in the paper. "I discovered I like being alone. I spent 48 years thinking I was an extrovert, that I loved being surrounded by people, but I was just regulating. When I stopped regulating, I realized that solitude is where I find myself." Another participant, a 52-year-old man named Mark, reported, "I spent my entire life believing that my purpose was to help, and when I stopped compulsively helping, I entered an existential crisis. Who am I if I'm not useful? It took months to realize I am me, and that is enough." Jung said that the individuation of the empath was the most difficult of all, because the empath has to betray the image that everyone has of them, and worse, the image that they have of themselves. But Huberman proved that it's possible. The brain, even after decades of conditioning, still has neuroplasticity. It can still learn that existing isn't dangerous. That self-care isn't betrayal. That selfishness, true sacred selfishness, isn't a vice. It's healing. And here's the part that academia doesn't want you to know. When empaths start to heal en masse, entire structures collapse, codependent relationships end, exploitative jobs lose employees, dysfunctional families go into crisis, because the empath has always been the stabilizer, the person who absorbed the chaos to keep everyone comfortable. And when the empath stops absorbing, the chaos returns to where it always belonged, with the person who created it. Jung saw this clinically, Huberman saw this neurologically, and both arrived at the same conclusion. Healing the empath doesn't just heal the empath, it exposes everyone around them who depended on their dysfunction. This video is different because we're not romanticizing empathy. We're naming trauma, and naming is the first step to deprogramming. If you've made it this far, you already know. You recognize the pattern. Between ages 2 and 7, you learn to read faces, anticipate collapses, regulate adults, and your brain etched this in as survival. But you don't need to survive that way anymore. And here's something that only those who finance this type of content understand. This video doesn't exist to go viral. It exists to deprogram, and deprogramming is dangerous. Because when you name patterns that the culture romanticizes, you become a target. The super thanks isn't about money. It's about you saying, "Someone finally named what I always felt but never could articulate." Keep doing this. Keep exposing what they hide, because every empath who wakes up liberates hundreds around them. When you click the golden heart, you're not supporting a channel. You're financing the next revelation, the next Jung-Huberman connection that academia buried, and you become part of who is rewriting the narrative. You're not a passive spectator. You're an ally of who is deprogramming. And that changes everything. Subscribe if you want the next protocols. because this was just the beginning. The next videos will show you how to identify who in your life loves you versus who loves the function, how to get out of codependent relationships without guilt, how to reconstruct identity after decades of dissolution, and now, the question that will define everything. In the comments, write parentified if you recognize the pattern. Write healing if you're already in the protocol. Write awake if this video changed how you see yourself, because when you name it publicly, you consolidate it neurologically. The act of declaring activates the prefrontal cortex. You're not just commenting, you're reprogramming. And if you still believe that you were born to serve, that empathy is your gift, that you are here to heal others, I leave you with the final message from Jung, found in his personal journal from 1949. The empath, who has never been selfish, isn't loving the world. They're running from themselves, and until they return, until they occupy the space that was denied them at age 4, they will never know who they really are. Huberman proved this 73 years later. The empath can heal, but the healing truly begins the moment he betrays that pre-programmed function and chooses simply to exist. And what about you? Will you continue down the path of perpetual usefulness, forever striving to meet everyone else's needs? Or will you finally begin to be authentically you?